Hello again, I'm Greg. This is a continuation of my new book on hermeneutics, the basic problems of hermeneutics. And today I want to sort of get into the issue of authority and the ability to question that authority, question its source, its suasion, its status, all of those things that, especially for young people today, are, I believe, necessities, not only to your peers and your own survival, but to the future of the species as a whole. And with that in mind, then, the question of authority takes us all the way back to what we take and have taken to be the greatest source of that authority, and that is the written word, the logos. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a very introductory manner today, and then we're just going to keep moving on. So just to follow this series, this is a different series, of course, than the writing workshop series, which is much more practical minded and mainly about fiction. But we will talk at some point about crafting nonfiction as well. But for now, in this series, we're talking about interpretation, authority, the word, and writing in general, and how you can begin to learn how to question authority as radically and right to the marrow of the issue as you possibly can. Again, an absolute necessity for you to sort of reveal and disclose to yourself your human existence. We begin, as I said, with history's greatest gift, writing, the text, word, logos. Though by far more recent than either music or image, let alone world, nevertheless it is text which animates the core of hermeneutics, and from which the dynamic of interpretation in general is sourced. Therefore, in the beginning with the word, however fittingly according to various cosmogonies, we are out to set up the very framework of the entire endeavor. Indeed, framing the canvas upon which the vast palette of interpretations is engaged in painting this or that picture of meaning first, and thence meaningfulness, we find the four traditionally understood modes of interpretation proper: authorial intent, historicity, presence, and historical consciousness. These are the four sort of modes and ideas that we have of where the point of interpretation is going. What is the purpose of interpreting something? Okay, we will briefly examine each of these as a way of both introducing the ideas associated with them as well as their chief sources, and then provide examples of how each genre of interpretation has taken its place as opinion within the history of hermeneutics itself. Just before this, however, we must do more than merely nod to the presence of writing in human history when I suggest that it is humanity's greatest invention, kindred only to the domestication of fire, a discovery rather than a pure invention. This earlier revelation allowed our species to essentially originate itself. This is fire. And very much more recently, of course, writing allowed for a revolution in human consciousness, making it what it is today and onward. I am asking you to consider what humanity would look like without it. We would be as prehistoric, excuse the term, as we indeed had been before its advent. Writing appears at the very dawn of sedentism, with its steep social stratification, monumental architecture, veteran witness and stewardship of the agrarian mode of production itself still novel, and less brilliantly lit, organized mass warfare, gender inequality, and caste slavery, among other shadows. Through writing, we suddenly can know what they knew, that is, our ancestors of antiquity. Yes, if we can interpret these earliest writings correctly. No doubt, much has been lost along the lengthy road that stretches out far back behind us, and on top of this, more could as well be lost in translation. In Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's short story Lot Number 249, the villain has discovered an ancient text which contains the instructions for reanimating mummies. His narcissism prevents him from utilizing this astounding knowledge for anything but vengeful purpose, and thus he is brought down, though perhaps temporarily, by his own willing hubris. But the penchant for thinking that ancient civilizations knew quite a bit more than what their ruins suggested reaches its nadir in the late Victorian period, when as well the idea of present-day progress drove all before it. Now, this idea itself was buried by John Barry in 1920, given the cataclysm of the Great War for Europe. Progress, as a concept even today, is noted rather in a whisper, as if to say it aloud would somehow be an utterance of heresy or yet apostasy. The idea of technical progress, speaking of hubris, is shipwrecked upon the wreck of RMS Titanic, while that moral is oft either associated with epithets of communism or is completely lost in the decoy of distracting entertainment fiction. So this sense of progress, of course, is troublesome for us. We want to believe in it. We certainly will wave the banners for it. The technocrats of today, the wizards of technology, certainly tout it and almost want to make us believe that the only kind of objective progress that humans can make is through technique and through technology. This is a fatal, I believe, error and an ethical error, but more on that later on. Moral progress was the order of the day for the 19th century, however. In its own version of self-contained narcissism, the past was as of much interest as was the future. The almost mystical quality of the query, "What did they know?" hails in part from the sense that the mind of God was the everlasting archetype for this kind of glinting suasion, and as well, following from this, that if we could glean something from our ancestral heritage, we ourselves could gain, say, a newer, better Babel, one more fitting to both its claims and its task. And we do ever babble onwards, so to speak, with current projects such as the human genome, artificial intelligence, cyberorganicism, and the search for extraterrestrial consciousness. It is this last which most closely betrays its kinship with archaeological quests, and famously, Carl Sagan's Cosmos episode, which juxtaposed the idea of alien intelligence and encounter with the rediscovery of ancient Egyptian civilization, remains the benchmark, both in its analogy and in its homology. Egypt had already long become the grail of ancient wisdom, the very Ark of the Covenant between past and present. But how did it become such a vision, grandiose and aggrandizing the both? It is because the hieroglyphics, the written language of ancient Egypt, had befuddled generations of scholars before a chance discovery in Rosetta gave contemporary minds the legend it needed to decipher it. Once accomplished, an entirely new world suddenly opened up before the astonished cultural landscape of Europe and beyond. It truly was as if an alien race had once populated our shared planet, and we were only now becoming aware of their virtuosity, one which contained nothing vapid nor venal, vacuous, or even vestigial. We imagined that it was all right there, simply to be translated, and that's known for us for any further time. This is due to the confluence of the beginning of modern hermeneutics with the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics. One could argue that the second would not have been possible without the first, for it was the comparative languages set that first devised the manner of reading the hitherto mysterious texts, when Champollion was able to cross-compare the unknown script with both Greek and Coptic in 1822. In this same decade, both Schleiermacher and Friedrich Ast had begun their generalization of hermeneutics, which until that point had been limited to the exegetical, that is, reading sacred texts or scripture alone. It was a major breakthrough for historians and archaeologists when Champollion published his Key, but both history first and then later on in the century archaeology as well were utterly transformed in themselves when Schleiermacher cast aside the old boundary associated with interpretation. No longer was the quest to know the mind of God the sole preserve of the hermeneut. Indeed, even if God remained the archetypical author and thus authority, given this, and not in spite of it, all other kinds of authorship, especially that of text, should be considered intimate kindred with the divine. It is somewhat difficult to imagine such a revelatory conclusion in our own times, when such a thing is past old hat, so much so that the very idea of authorial intent has long passed out of fashion in far wider discourses than simply literary and cultural criticism, where the movement to broaden the scope of interpretation first took hold with writers such as Ruskin and Carlyle in English and Dilthey in German. Even so, at the very least, we yet employ this first genre of the hermeneutic circle every waking day. What did this politician really mean by saying what he did? And however earth-moving such utterances might be, yet more importantly, what did my spouse mean when she said that? I think you get the picture. In spite of all the transformations occurring within the hermeneutic arc, and which will be duly detailed later on, we still must come to terms with this first revolution, that of the intention of the author, or the creator, or the speaker, anyone. Okay, what do they mean? It remains of the utmost in mundane life, whether at work, at home, in the schools, or the agora, mostly digital, of our contemporaneity. And of late, when there truly does not have to be an author at all, belatedly fulfilling Barth's famous epigram regarding the death of such, all the more are we tasked with deciphering the virtual hieroglyphs of misinformation, disinformation, and sheer cant, as well as the more traditional lies, damned lies, and statistics. In short, the author may be dead, but authorship lives on, as does the authority that inevitably becomes associated with it. At the source of this concern, part fetish and part Babylonian brick, embodying thus both a form and a function, is the relationship between intent and meaning. If the old song exhorts us to say what you mean what you say, before one thing leads to another, then we are well aware that misinterpretation can verily pave the road to hell. And yet, who is to say what is a reasonable interpretation of this or that, and what flies outside the bounds of all good reason and perhaps good taste alike? Is that who also an authority? And how can one be an authority about authority? This is a moment when we must halt our historical breviary and give serious focus to the problem of establishing authority in the first place. Schleiermacher himself schooled, as were all of his peers, in the sense that interpretation was not only exclusively to be concerned with sacred text, but was, in the end, also only necessary to such, given that though we mortals could with effort come to understand the Logos, we could never actually speak it into being. Recall that the Greek messenger god Hermes, from whose name apocryphally hermeneutics is derived, had ironically no need of interpretation, as his peers understood the Logos with complete clarity and transparency. They were gods, after all. Only we humans, who have been placed at a distance from Godhead through both the acts of Prometheus and the general weave of the fates, had need of interpretative work in order to approach the genuine meaning of the word, expressed here in sacred scripture and there in temple utterances. Proverbially, it was one of those latter that gave the early Greek historians the cavil they needed to further supplant mythos with logos. Herodotus notes that the cryptic character of Delphi, build wooden walls, was at first utterly unhelpful to the Athenian cause, when Themistocles realized that the oracle was simply referring to the city's lack of a viable naval force in repelling a Persian invasion. The Greeks duly followed this interpretation and defeated the invaders at Salamis in 480 BCE. In one stroke, we have the entire contrast between mythic thought and historical thought laid out. That Western consciousness preserves this contrast, considered rather sacred in itself by almost all, with perhaps the exception of politicians, was at base what prevented the decipherment of the hieroglyphs and other like lost languages for some time. It was precisely due to the fact that such languages and their attendant worldviews had been developed before the separation of mythos and logos, and so their entire sense of being and of consciousness were markedly different from our own. Okay, so this is the very beginning then of how we are able to think about the question about questioning authority. Okay, so many of you out there, especially young people, you want to question it. Okay, somebody makes a demand of you or tells you that you can't do this and you shouldn't do that, and you're thinking in your heads, okay, well, I would like to question that. I'm not exactly sure how I can, or maybe if I even dare to question it. You witness things around the world all the time on the news. There's people who are killed for questioning the authority, depending on that authority's status and access to resources and the ability to wield power in the very much Maoist sense that it emanates, as it were, from the proverbial barrel of the gun. We saw that on the streets of Iran for some weeks. There was a sense that questioning the authority of that particular regime could be a fatal act, and it was for many. So there is a risk, for sure, but the better we know the history of the question of authority, and then the history of authority as a concept itself, the better equipped we will be then to begin to question it and to sort of strike the right tone so that our question doesn't immediately appear threatening to the authority itself. Okay, it gets the authority to disclose what it's really about. Okay, so why are you making this demand of me? Or do you have the reasonable right to make that demand? Is it in my best interest? And who's to decide what my best interest is? All of those things, especially for young people today, absolutely crucial for you to begin this exercise and then take it, as it were, to the streets, whether it's in the schools or whether it's in your homes with your parents or whether it's online with your peers or, questioning the kinds of political and commercial advertisements with which we all are bombarded on a daily basis. So all of that is at stake, and we'll continue in part 2 of text as we go along. So look for that, and until then, we'll see you later.